The Ukrainian offensive into Kursk Oblast goes into the second day, and at least according to Russian mill bloggers, there's either a second front line already opening up or about to be opened up. We'll talk about this and what we can expect from this offensive in reference to international experts and my view at the facts in this situation report, but we'll also obviously talk about what else happened and what else happened along the front line. So welcome to this situation report about the war in Ukraine. We'll start off with the Ukrainian attack on the Morozov airfield that happened a couple of days ago. We have more details now, and here you can see this is the picture I showed you last time. We have more details now that show the actual devastation. This is a lot of glide bombs that are no longer going to be launched on Ukraine that were destroyed in this. But that's not all. We have also this here. This is a Sukhoi 34. The fighter bomber that is mostly used for those glide bombs. At least one is destroyed. Some claims are up to 2 destroyed and 1 damaged. So the Ukrainians had a significant success there. The bad news of the story is though that Forbes reported that Ukraine begged the US for months to be allowed to use ATACMS against the airfield, as they had bombers parked wingtip to wingtip, and the US did not give them the permission. So the Ukrainians had to try it with their own drones with the limited efficiency that leads out of this in comparison to ATACMS with cluster munition. Now let's switch to the northern front, where the Ukrainians have entered Kursk Oblast, and I need to say something basic about this. Yesterday I made a video about it, and I showed my skepticism about this attack while referencing Ukrainian officers, and some here apparently believe that I am supposed to run a propaganda channel or that I'm supposed to be a cheerleader for Ukraine. Now, while I want to make it perfectly clear that Ukraine is on the right side here, that Ukraine deserves to win, that Ukraine should win, yes, that Ukraine must win, that doesn't mean that I'm going to be a shill propagandist, somebody who cheers things up that where he has skepticism. If you're looking for something like this, I'm sure you find plenty of channels to do this. I personally know a couple that do it for either the Russian or the Ukrainian side. You can easily see it when you have the topics, the channels reporting one victory after the other for either side, then you know that you're at the right place there. But this channel here is not going to do this. This is not what I intend to do here. And at that point, I want to give my heartfelt thanks to those who appreciate the way I do it. Unfortunately, it's less appreciated on YouTube. It's less successful than a pure propaganda channel, but I know that I can keep looking into the mirror when I do this, and I know that the vast majority of you appreciates that. So thank you, my heartfelt thank you. We are going to this because yesterday in the short video about the offensive, I showed my skepticism. Ukraine is in a very troubled position along the Donbass, and why they would open up a new front there leaves a lot of questions unanswered, and we have a lot of international experts. Basically every international expert that is worth his salt I've seen at the very least skepticism and worry on that side, whether that was a smart decision. But the Russians are now saying they are bringing in reinforcements, both Chechens as well as regular reserves. There are Russian reports, though, that the Chechens were on the front line, on the border, and immediately redeployed to more favorable positions, or to say it in other words, they ran away the very moment the Ukrainians were coming. By now, the report is that the Ukrainians have captured 10 towns or even a little more in the area of Sucha. Here, the rough front line that is supposedly already done should be something like this here, that is more or less being said, which should be under Ukrainian control. They are definitely inside of Sucha, and they might have captured it. The first voice is claiming they have captured it, so they are attacking here, and this is no longer a PR stunt like the 2 attacks by the RDK were in the past. Now the Ukrainians are having some success here. Apart from the territory, we see an FPV drone here chasing down a helicopter. The Ukrainians reporting that this was a Mi-8, and here we see a Mi-20 28, which was hit here. And according to Riba, so the big Russian mill blogger, this was actually successful. The rear rotor was hit. it had to do an emergency landing and the crew is still alive. This is at least what the Russians claim, but we know that they have been successful. There are also claims now that the Ukrainians have shot down a Sukhoi 35 and a Sukhoi 34. I have yet to see any proof of this, so by now it's unclear. But what we do have is report from the Ukrainians that these actions definitely did not involve the fighters of the Russian Volunteer Corps. So now we have regular Ukrainian troops that have crossed into Russia for the first time in serious amounts, apart from some special forces. Also, Ukrainian deep reconnaissance units. Reconnaissance units are behind the front line, active in this area, and this is one of the debates to which degree the Ukrainians have actually captured 10 towns so far, because rolling through a town with an Humvee or with 1 or 2 BTRs is one thing, actually consolidating control over it is a different story. But they are operating, and they're operating ever deeper into Ukraine, even though the depth is like 15 to 20 kilometers by now. The number is unclear. It's very likely that we are still talking about less than 1,000 men, somewhere in the mid 3 digits to the high 3 digits. Two majors are talking about, the Russian bloggers are talking about an additional 2,000 men that are ready to become the second echelon, basically to reinforce the first units if they need to. Rumors are up to 4 brigades that are being involved, but then again, we need to differentiate. A big brigade might have the size of 5 to 8,000 men, but that doesn't mean 5 to 8,000 men cross over. Technically, 2 brigades are involved if one guy from each brigade marches in. So the exact number of the Ukrainian advances are unclear, but it seems highly likely that as of now we are talking about less than 1,000 men that is being used. Now, this is, we have to say at this point, this is not a usage of manpower yet that would shift the overall situation at another front. So it's not like the fact that the Ukrainians use them here would otherwise change the overall situation in the Donbass. This might excuse the Ukrainian advance here if we are critical, but at the same time, we obviously can't give them a general carte blanche here, as smaller reinforcements might be small, but they add up to bigger ones, and smaller losses add up to bigger ones as well. So even if the losses right now might be insignificant in the overall picture, continuous insignificant losses will amount to significant ones. So let's talk about what they are actually aiming for. There were some claims that they might run for the nuclear power plant to have like something against Russia in their hand, but this is purely delusional. The nuclear power plant is up here, that's 60 kilometers away from the front line. So they would have to march in and secure their flanks on both sides. That would be an additional, let's say, roughly 150 kilometers of the front line. This would likely take a 5-digit amount of troops and not just barely 5 digits. So we are talking about a massive event here. This is delusional. Further plans that they would go even further is even more nonsense. So let's not even talk about this. So what could be other goals? They might want to fix reserves and to ease the pressure on the front line in other parts. That could make sense if Ukraine has troops that are not engaged at any point, but are there anyways, because Ukraine guards its border, so the Russians don't have an easy time marching in, while the Russians on the other side did not guard their border to the same amount, as we can see right now. So if Ukraine has some forces that are fixed there anyways to stir up some trouble, to force the Russians to send in, would make a lot of sense, but it only makes sense if Russia is forced to draw in units that otherwise would have been used anyways. So troops that are in a planned offensive or troops that are currently engaged in the Donbass. And here I have 2 experts for you. That was the wrong one. Yeah, I have 2 experts, Tatarigami here, saying that basically the same as Rob Lee says. You can pause the videos in each case. Basically both say we are talking about conscripts, FSB border troops, and reserves that were there already. So this is not something where the Russians are going to send in reinforcements. At least that was the initial expectations, that they would miss at some other point. So if the Ukrainians march into and only draw in local reserves that are there anyways, so what's the whole point, you might ask? Then fixing troops there doesn't make too much sense, as the conscripts can't be used in the war in Ukraine, and FSB border troops aren't used in the war in Ukraine, and the Russians had some local reserves there anyways. Another option might be it's a preemptive strike to steer up some trouble and make it harder for Russia to gather troops for an own operation. We had Budanov warning about a coming invasion in Sumy. We had Zelensky talking about an invasion that the Russians are planning northwest of Kharkiv, which this is basically northwest of Kharkiv, somewhere up here, if we want it this way. This might make sense, but it would only make sense if the Ukrainians cause enough trouble that the loss ratio is in their favor. If the Ukrainians just cause trouble and then lose troops at a 1-to-1 ratio, they can't afford this, having less manpower, having less material. If they achieve 1-to-5 ratio, this might be a different story, but it would be a risky gamble at this point. Now, another option is that it's aimed at cutting off a railway line, which we have here. And the railway line we can see here, this is the town of, what was it called? Sucha. This is the town of Sucha, and we can see that the railway line is right there, right at it. This would obviously help, as this is the railway line that supplies the forces along the whole route here, but it would only cut it. It would not destroy it. So these parts of the front line could still be supplied from the north. These parts of the front line could still be supplied from the east. It would stop any communication along that line, across it, but not much, not more. Now, it might be that the demand in reinforcements, that the demand in supply, that the demand in traffic is so high in this region. Don't forget, we have Vovchansk down here, that the demand is so high that the capacity of this is not sufficient in regards to the demand. Unfortunately, that's far beyond my skill level to be able to judge that, to calculate that. So while it's a theoretical possibility, I don't think it's too likely, at least looking at the map and looking at the existing railway lines. It seems that, yeah, it might offer some advantages, but it shouldn't offer a decisive advantage. Looking at the topographic map, we see that Sucha is in the valley, and the Ukrainians mostly held the high ground already, so marching into the valley makes no sense. They are in a more vulnerable position here if the Russians are on the high ground. Taking this part here, solidifying their control over the high ground, you could argue that makes sense, but taking Sucha and crossing over it makes no sense. And if they want to take the next high ground completely, they're basically almost at the border of Kursk city itself. So this is not really valid. That doesn't make too much sense to advance too much in this direction if you just think about solidifying your position in a topographic sense. We can argue about fortifications, because the Russian fortifications are behind the front line. They're roughly at this point here, according to maps that I found. Taking them would obviously be an advantage for the Ukrainians in the defense as well, but we have to see that those fortifications are meant to guard in the direction of Ukraine, not in the direction of Russia. So fire areas that are designated, the positions are dug in a way so they can fire towards Ukraine, not in the back. They take advantage of geography, of topography, of buildings, of rocks, of rivers, of anything to enhance their position, but in a way aimed at the then different direction. All these advantages that were chosen in setting up the fortifications were aimed in the Ukrainian direction, not in the Russian. So while the Ukrainians would have some advantages, the advantages would be much smaller than for the Russians if they properly man it. And it doesn't even include the solidifying structures, the structures ahead of them, like dragon teeth, like potential duct tank ditches. All of those would then be behind the own line, if the Ukrainians take it. So yeah, I guess it could help, but it's not really convincing either. An argument could be they want to take some so they have something to trade, but this only makes sense if the negotiations are coming and the Ukrainians are still controlling it. So if the Ukrainians want to take something now and to have something to give back to Russia to get something themselves, okay, makes sense. But they have to now capture it and then hold it until the negotiations come, which are unlikely to come before the US election, or at least or even worse, until the next US president is inaugurated, maybe even later. So that would be fairly ambitious. But then at the same time, obviously, it would make sense to take as much as possible, ideally several oblasts, so yeah, they can change one to one. But this is illusionary as of now, we have to say. Economic was also mentioned because a gas station is at Sucha. So I guess it's a pumping station from my understanding for the gas pipelines. We have a map here, but it shows that Sucha is just one of them that is crossing. There were some arguments that this might mean in regards to Slovakia and Hungary, but as we can see, there are plenty of other pipelines. So even if they capture it, destroy it, or whatever, it should not be the decisive part that stops Ukraine or that gives Ukraine some advantage. This might play a role, but I don't see how it would. So it's too early to really say what the Ukrainian side is planning and what their goals are here. This time, it's not a PR event. They don't want to just draw attention to them. But we have to say, in the end, the offensive has to have an improved has to lead to an improved strategic situation if it's supposed to be successful. So basically said, once this is done, Ukraine has to be closer to victory or further away from defeat than it is right now, than it is at the beginning of it. Otherwise, it's a net loss. And it's too early to judge this now. At the same time, it obviously makes sense to question what is the point of it. As said, I read a lot of international experts, and the majority, I don't think I read one serious expert who was cheering, who was saying this is the smartest idea since sliced bread. At the very least, they were skeptic and hesitant, and some were outright saying doesn't make no sense. We had Tatarigami who said that whoever thinks about this is mentally disabled. This is the degree of judging in that way. But in the end, we have to say, in Germany, we say the bill is done at the end. So far it's too early, and we have successes of the Ukrainians. They take prisoners. Okay, we can argue maybe they gain prisoners to exchange against their own, but that doesn't make too much sense either. I think the expended material and personnel should not justify taking 40, 80, 100 or 200 prisoners so they can exchange them for 200 own ones. I don't think that's an argument, even though some might come to that. But we have a new map, Riba map. Riba is a Russian mill blogger, and this map is interesting. Now, not only does it show us here what the Ukrainians have already taken, mind you, this is pro-Russian, state-affiliated mill blogger, so this we can judge more or less. This should be the least the Ukrainians have taken. Now we see they are advancing in this direction. They have taken it. They are at the outskirts of Sucha. We have Sucha here. We see that they are right at the outskirts, have probably already taken outskirts. All of this is good. But there's one detail that could be overlooked at this, and this is what's happening up here. Up here, we see indicated that supposedly they are advancing in here. And this is now getting interesting because this is nowhere close to them. This is up here. This is the direction Lukhiv to Rilsk. So according to them, the Ukrainians are pushing in this regard. Now, if this is the truth, then we're adding a whole new level. Because if we are not just facing a Ukrainian advance in this direction, color, if we're not just talking about an advance here, but also an advance here, then suddenly a lot of things make additional sense. Because if you look at the topographic map here, if you look at the topographic map, you see this is Sucha. The Ukrainians basically hold the high ground already. We could argue it might make sense to take this part here. Here, on the other hand, they have limited geographic advantage. Okay, you can argue they have the high ground here, but here it's already crossing over. Here is a little low ground. Here, on the other hand, they are on the high ground together with the Russians. But what you can see here is a river, and I measured it. It's the Reka Seum, I don't know. So the river here, it has a width of, I measured at two places, 75 meters. So this is a more serious geographical barrier, and over 30 kilometers right next to it is a high ground, and a fairly significant one. If we check it here, 140 to 230. That's 70 meters higher within a kilometer or less. So if this is actually happening, and mind you, I have not seen evidence yet that the Ukrainians are actually advancing this. I am taking Russian mill bloggers that supposedly there is a second advance. But if this was the truth, and we are looking at the map here, what then suddenly we can say a lot of things make additional sense. If the Ukrainians advance and take a line to Rilsk down here, then maybe here, somewhere like this, they have half the front line. I measured it. Around here is roughly 152 kilometers. If you go along the river here, you're at 77 kilometers. So they halve the distance that they have to guard. They gain favorable ground with 30 kilometers. Among them is a water barrier, high ground at various parts. The Russians lose the high ground and they gain some Russian territory as occupied that they can in some later point trade out, while they have shortened their front line, while they have reduced their theoretical necessity of personnel, even though that's probably not 100% true, because the Russians will be much more serious to push in this direction than they would at whatever, the joint border. But they could shorten the front line, and the overall distance here in as the crow flies is 25 kilometers. So this is not impossible if the forces are strong enough. I don't want to say that this is the Ukrainian goal. I am not saying the Ukrainians are going to achieve this or that they send enough troops, but for me, I was baffled about the whole event. I thought it's a waste of resources. Now, if they go for this, I'm a little more optimistic and a little more believing that they could achieve it, because they were using the fact that the Russians had an advantage that was only basically mirrored in the Vietnam War, that one side crosses with its troops across the international border at will, and the other one doesn't dare to do it. We know it in the Vietnam War. The US didn't operate in northern Vietnam, at least not officially. They bombed it, okay, but they didn't enter it with ground forces to crush the North Vietnamese, while the North Vietnamese crossed the border at will. And we had that here for 2.5 years, that the Ukrainians didn't dare seriously cross the border, while the Russians were crossing it whenever it pleased them, with sabotage groups up to with mechanized battalions, mechanized forces crossing over. And this leads to them having barely reinforced the front line. They used conscripts there. The argument that I brought you, that the forces they're fixing aren't worth it. Even if they destroy 5,000 conscripts in this battle, it's good for morale for Ukrainians. But those 5,000 conscripts wouldn't have fought in the Donbass, whereas every Ukrainian that falls could have been used in the Donbass. So this wouldn't make too much sense in my point, but should this actually go for something like this, then the whole game might change to a certain degree. As said, it's far too early to say that this is going to happen. It's far too early to say that the Ukrainians will achieve this. But should they achieve this, then they will have improved their tactical situation, because they have an easier to defend front line. At the same time, they will steer up the front line, because Russia can't accept that. And Russia can't accept that the Ukrainians might do the same here. Why not cross over here and shorten it? And now we could look at topographic maps. There might be other points where they could do the same. Why not here, for instance? So there are tons of places where the Ukrainians could shorten the front line by simply crossing into the neighboring town, into Russia. So far, they haven't done this. If they actually do it, then Russia will be forced to reinforce the whole front line. It's more serious to prevent the Ukrainians from doing this, and then the whole mission might actually be successful. But I said, like, I can quote you a ton of international and Ukrainian experts who were devastated by the news. They were saying we are losing town after town after town in Donbass because of lack of manpower, because we don't have enough soldiers, and the commander-in-chief uses manpower that would be so direly needed for a PR coup. Now let's see how it turns out. We'll keep an eye on it, but at least there suddenly I see some point. All the other arguments I had before, geographically, topographically, PR, fixing Russian troops, none of this made sense to me. Should they actually be able to shorten the front line, then we might talk about something else. So let's switch to the rest of the front line. North of the Seversky Donetsk, I have no confirmed changes. South of the Seversky Donetsk, the Russians have advanced roughly until, I think, here. We have a geolocation for this. Here. They have advanced somewhat in the, maybe it's, check, it's at the bottom part. Yeah, more or less, maybe here. So they have advanced a little bit north of Bilohorivka, nothing serious, but a Russian success nonetheless. South of it, in the Sivest direction, we have a Russian success north of Rostolivka. Rostolivka has recently fallen, and here we have now a geolocation of 2 positions here along the railroad line. So the Russians have advanced to roughly here and here in the last couple of days. At Chasiv Yar, there's additional fighting. I have a fresh geolocation of Ukrainian troops here on this part, but this is gray zone, so nothing has changed here. And we have the next change here in the Toretsk direction at Pivnichne, and here we have the Russians already had them already in this part. Now, the original video shows Ukrainians doing counterattacks. So this is a gray zone now. This is not occupied permanently by the Russians. The original video shows corpses too, so I obviously can't show it to you, but we had the Russians already operating in this area here, showing that they keep advancing in Pivnichne and are at the outskirts of Toretsk itself. So the Russian successes continue in this direction. At Avdiivka, the Russians have advanced in New York. They raised a flag on a building. We have a geolocation for this. Here in the northwest, they already raised it, as you can see here. So New York hasn't fallen yet, but the situation is getting massively worse. While at the same time, the Ukrainians seem to have started to evacuate the front line here in the south. This was recently started to being attributed to the Russians, and according to reports I have, the Ukrainians are more or less evacuating from this area here now as well. So they will do what's necessary to prevent being cut off in this area. Further west, I do not have confirmed significant changes. Now, east of Shelane, the Russians have gained this tree line here, from what I've seen. This seems to be all that has happened here in this direction. Some new geolocations in Krasnohorivka, but nothing that changes the overall picture, nothing that I can leads me to confirm a change in territory. And when we go down south, I have no changes whatsoever again. Along the whole front line, Orikhiv, Velika Novosilka, again, fresh geolocations, but nothing that changes the assessment I had in the past. The biggest news from the south is from the Dnipro front. There, the Russians were reporting that the Ukrainians did an amphibious, or they claim they did an attempt to do an amphibious landing on the Tendrivska spit. This is this here. The Russians say they defeated it and destroyed several boats. The Ukrainians on their side report that they were successful. They show a video that's supposed to show the success, even though it's not conclusive to me, and they claim that several armored fighting vehicles were destroyed, as well as some electronic warfare equipment. Overall situation is basically unchanged. We talked about it. The Russians keep advancing here in the east. The Ukrainians have gone on the offensive, and at least, then again, let me repeat myself. So far, I do not see definite proof that the Ukrainians are actually advancing in this direction. So all of this might not be true. We don't know a lot of things we do not know yet. But it seems the Ukrainians plan something at least a little bigger than the past incursions into Russia here in this area in western Kursk Oblast. But overall, that was it, what we have in changes. Then we have troop generations. We have news from the for Ukraine. Here we have the report that according to that, it was identified that the IFF system, identification friend-foe system of the planes, was showing that they were American. Now, this was a surprise initially because the Americans have refused to give Ukraine F-16s, while they should have more than enough to hand over to Ukraine. And this would prove that American systems have been delivered. But now we know why recently Antonov 124, I think it was seen flying to the United States, because they picked up some F-16s, but they are decoys. They are going to be used as decoys, and it's probably for a reason that camouflage netting was covering them, that we had the front closed. They probably don't have an engine in anymore. They have been stripped out to a certain degree and are going to occupy the airfield, so the Russians have something to shoot at and don't really know which F-16 is the actual working one, which one is the decoy. So the assessment right now is that while those are ex-US Air Force F-16s, they are not some that are operational. Then we have news in the international front. Putin supposedly has asked Iran to hold back, to show restraint when it comes to attacking Israel in regards to civilian targets. A lot of Israeli citizens also have the Russian passport, so this might be in the reaction to it, and obviously he might fear a massive Israeli retaliation. So far the attack hasn't happened yet, but all the indications are that it is going to happen, that Iran is going to strike Israel, and quite seriously though. But as said, as of the finishing the research for this episode, nothing has happened yet. New York Times was reporting that Iran has received modern air defense systems as well as radar systems from Russia. So Russia is militarily helping Iran against Israel as well. That was it for today with the situation report. I have nothing else to report. If you enjoyed this report and if you enjoy the way I do it, even though I know a couple out there are enraged for the fact that I'm not a pure cheerleader despite taking sides. If you enjoy this, please give it a thumbs up. It helps with the algorithm. Leave a comment in the comment section. And if you're new here and you appreciate what I do, I would appreciate a subscription and hit the bell icon so you don't miss future videos. This channel is only possible because of the support of viewers like you. So if you'd like to support the channel, you can do so by the means in the description. But that's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.